We're here on the interior plateau just southwest of Kamloops, British Columbia in coniferous forest. It's part of the interior Douglas fir zone, and we're going to use this site to illustrate the Luvasolic order in the Canadian System of Soil Classification. So Paul, do you want to give us a little bit more context for this, this soil?
Sure. Well, the Luvasolic soils are really the most extensive soil of the forested parts of the British Columbia central and southern interior. So the site that we're going to look at today is one that's pretty typical of much of the plateau country of southern British Columbia and on up into the central interior as well. So we find Luvasolic soils on the plateau at medium, higher elevations in climates that are not excessively wet, and on parent materials that contain sufficient clay to be translocated, to be moved down through the profile to give us the BT horizons that are the most characteristic features of the Luvasolic order. So we find the Luvasols then on the medium and fine textured glacial deposits.
I think this would be a good time to run through some of the soil forming factors that resulted in this profile here.
Okay. Well, the parent material, as I mentioned, is a medium textured glacial till, so it was deposited during the last ice age. The texture of the parent material is probably a loam to clay loam. The vegetation that's around us right here is part of the interior Douglas fir zone, so we're looking at predominantly a Douglas fir forest, some lodgepole pine, a kind of a sparse grassy understory vegetation. The climate here is moister than we saw in the grasslands at lower elevation in the Kamloops area. So there's enough excess moisture that we can get a greater degree of downward translocation of materials through the soil profile. The predominant process that we're looking at involved in forming soils of the Luvasolic order is the redistribution or downward translocation of clay. So we have to have some clay present initially, and in this particular profile we see that the removal of clay from the upper part of the soil has resulted in an enrichment of clay a few centimeters farther down in the profile in what we call the BT horizon. Chemically, this is a soil that has moderately acidic pH in the upper horizons, but there are carbonates present in the parent material. So we do find lime in the C horizon, approximately 50 or 60 centimeters down from the surface at the lower part of this exposure. The forest floor that we see is not really all that thick, and that makes sense because we have not that high a rate of litter input. This isn't the most productive forest type in the interior. So we have a relatively thin forest floor, and then the sequence of horizons that we observe as a result of this process of downward migration of clay. We have a very thin AH horizon, so not a great deal of intermixing of organic matter into the mineral soil. Then we have a grayish AE horizon here, from which clay has been removed. So the texture here is approximately a silt loam. And then a little bit farther down we get into the BT horizon. Now it's not particularly strongly structured here, but we do have a noticeable enrichment of clay. So the texture increases from a silt loam here to a clay loam down here in the BT horizon. And then we see a color change which marks the transition to the C horizon, and within the C horizon we begin to see calcium carbonate appearing as a thin white film on the underside of these larger coarse fragments. When we put a few drops of acid, then we get quite vigorous effervescence on the carbonate coating. So we go from moderately acidic pHs near the surface down to free carbonates just near the bottom of this exposure. So that would be a difference of pH of probably 3, maybe even 4 units over that distance.
Okay, and the fact that the organic matter hasn't moved very much must indicate biological activity is pretty confined to the top part of the profile.
And we notice that most of the tree roots as well are located just below the forest floor in the A horizon and don't go all that far into the BT horizon. And that makes sense because it's fairly dense. It will present a bit of a barrier to root penetration.
Paul, could we talk about this Luvasol here as a component of managed forest systems? What are the significance of what we've talked about, the soil profile relative to managing a forest in this soil?
Okay, so these, as I said, are very important forest soils in the BC interior. So most gray Luvasols are used for either forest production or also for forest range use as well. And the finer textures that are present in this B horizon, fairly close to the surface of this profile, does have an important influence on the behavior of this soil in forest use. In this kind of dry climate, having finer textured materials fairly close to the surface, just within or at the base of the rooting zone, is an advantage because of the water holding capacity, so that assists with forest production. But it also requires a certain amount of caution, because when finer textures are present near the surface of a forest soil, it does mean that you have to be careful about controlling traffic from either harvesting or site preparation during periods of time when the soil is moist, because under those conditions you may damage soil structure and cause compaction, which can impair the productivity of this kind of a site. So the presence of these finer textures can benefit productivity, but it does mean that you have to be careful about preventing compaction.
Paul, particularly up in the area that you come from, in the BC Central Interior and other northern Canadian regions, these soils have been converted to agriculture, been cleared and cultivated. Could you talk about the impact of that soil in that kind of a management regime?
Sure. Well, as you can see, there is very little organic matter in the top layers of the mineral soil, and so this means that during land clearing and site preparation, you really want to try and avoid displacement or destruction of this fairly limited amount of organic matter near the surface. And because these A horizons are very rich in silt and poor in organic matter, in agricultural soils you do have some problems with adverse structure, and this kind of soil can be prone to crusting, which can present problems for things like seedling emergence.
And from a soil fertility point of view, we probably also have some nutrient deficiencies that would come in.
Yes, so a soil that is fairly low in organic matter, as a cultivated version of this would be, then you would be dealing with limitations for nitrogen and any of the other nutrients that tend to be associated with organic matter, such as sulfur and perhaps phosphorus.
How would this be as a site for building for a rural residential or urban development?
Well, I think the main limitation that one would need to think about, particularly in a low-density rural development where there is no sewer system, if you're going to be using septic tanks, then you have to think about what sort of infiltration properties, what sort of permeability the soil has. And when you have a particularly high clay content and low permeability fairly close to the surface, then that's going to present a bit of a constraint for how well septic fields are going to work.